As we move into the first years of a third millennium, there's a new sense of the material and a new sense of the spiritual. I was part of this material, which is very much abroad on the waters of our being. And Aurobindo's presence at this present moment in time, as Manodda mentioned just now, somehow is widespread on this canvas of both time and space. Out of this, a perspective emerges for me, a perspective which I think is being shared very widely around the world at this moment. And this perspective has three sequences which unfold, partly in parallel terms and partly in sequential terms. I'd like to share those. The first Manodda had touched upon in the early years of the 20th century, when Aurobindo looked ahead at his life and the mission that he had for this life, because he always had a sense of mission that he had to work out. And he foresaw that a great crisis, a great civilizational crisis, was going to come upon man in the foreseeable future. Imagine, he sees it in something like 1904, 1910, as early as that. The terms in which he saw that crisis is somehow very significant, because we who come and stand here 100 years later, we can see how it has developed and how it has worked itself out and where we stand today at that point of the crisis. He foresaw that with the development of the mental faculty in man and the growth of science and the technology that science put at our disposal, man would create a very big and complex structure of civilization. Huge and gigantic machinery, because science tends to standardize. It has to regularize. It has to create uniform patterns which are repetitive and which can be applied in all cases given certain conditions. And he foresaw that this would land us into a situation where man would not have the moral, the volitional, the emotional capacity to handle a machinery that gigantic. And that the imbalance between what man has created in the objective world and subjectively in his quality of consciousness, of willing, of acting, of feeling, he is unable to hold it. He foresaw that moment 100 years back, but he saw it as a crisis of evolution, as Manodda has also indicated. He did not see it as something which was like an impending disaster for man's existence on earth. He did not see it as something that was without any hope for the future, which was like an end catastrophe. Not at all. It is very interesting how he saw it. And that, I think, is something which can rejuvenate us a great deal at the present moment. He saw it as a crisis in the very process of evolution on Earth. To make it more specific, he said the mental capacity of man, the mental faculty, had developed to such an extreme point. In fact, the most accelerated part of its growth was since the European Renaissance of the 16th century. And we know the tremendous results that we've had because of that. But the mind works in a certain manner. All that it can create as result, as consequence of civilization, can only be of the nature in which it functions. It functions with its best capacity is that of analysis. It can analyze things into components, into parts, study them well. Its action is divisive. And yet it constantly seeks unity. That is the irony of its existence, of the mind, of the mental faculty. Its real function is to analyze, divide, segment, understand, put things together as aggregates. But it seeks desperately for unity and for synthesis. But it can't arrive at them. It tries through philosophy, through art, through psychology, through the social sciences, even through the natural sciences themselves, when it tries to interrelate the result of the sciences and the disciplines that have been followed to an extreme point in their isolation. It tries to put them together, but it's not able to arrive at a synthesis. Now, Aurobindo saw this very interestingly as a moment of human evolution, when the faculty of mind, which had been developed so much, had reached its nth point of achievement, like we see in the past century, which Aurobindo had not yet seen early in the 20th century, but today in the 21st, we see the achievements that we've arrived at in the last century. And at that point, where the achievements are at its highest, and the limitations are also the most acute, like we see today, like we see in the state of the world, whether it is a question of the individual's own psychological existence, or of societies, or of nations, or the relationships between nations and between cultures and civilizations and religions, which are very major issues at the moment. Now, when a faculty arrives at the greatest possible achievement, but also evinces the acutest limitations that are inherent in its manner of functioning, one can be sure that one is ready to move on into another phase of evolution of consciousness, and another quality of consciousness can become accessible to the highest product in evolution, which at present is the man, human being. It's interesting, this way of seeing it, because today a lot of forward thinking is bearing on to this point. But Aurobindo, practical, pragmatic, yogic as he was, he has, in a true Indian sense of yogic tradition, he had a question. When man arrives at that point, which was yet a moment in the future, how would he deal with it? What would he do with it? How would he move on to a possibility of arriving at a higher consciousness? How would he tackle the crisis? And the crisis is with us today at every inch of our living and existence and every aspect of our life. And therefore, he felt the need to create a new form of yoga. A new form of yoga is, I think, the best way to describe what he has created, what he has himself called integral yoga, which could accelerate the process if one followed it. If one did not wish to, the very processes of life would lead you to that. Because if we cast a look back, we know at least of a time when there was no perhaps living or sentient creature on earth. It was just inanimate matter. That much we have learned through biology and the other natural sciences. But as matter develops in its possibilities of life, or evinces something, life emerges in it. And the most simple and early forms of life emerge in it. As living matter gains in its complexity of inner organization, more complex forms of life emerge in it. You have the plant and degrees of plant life. Then you have the animal, the human. But at the same time, none of the previous levels, like matter or life or living matter, are left behind. They also grow in their possibility of organizing themselves in a more effective and complex manner. And when man comes, we have the human faculty par excellence of the thinking mind, the organizational mind, the planning mind. But our embodiment is still in a body. We still have a body like has grown up through the different stages of evolution. We have the prana, the life part in us, the emotional part, the volitional part, but it is more complex than it was before man came on the scene. So as a new faculty emerges, the ones that have emerged earlier in our evolution do not remain where they were, otherwise there'd be no base for growth, but they also grow in a corresponding manner, because the higher faculties are actually involved, the other process of evolution, in all that has gone before, in the preceding things. If life emerges out of matter, it must have been somewhere present in matter. It can't be injected into matter artificially from the outside. At a certain stage of the subtlety of matter, life emerges. When life in matter grows more subtle, mind emerges. If mind has reached its acme of achievement and the most acute form of limitation, then the next higher level of consciousness must be preparing the ground for its own emergence. This greater realm of consciousness, or rather, let us say, he envisages a whole series, an entire range of consciousness beyond the mental. And in ordinary life too, we have enough evidence of it. You have it in the case of a genius. You have it in the case of mystics or seers or great scientists. There's always the evidence of a faculty other than what you call the purely analytic mental. It's always there, but we don't look at those and form a pattern out of it. If we see an instance repeated often enough, then you can know that it forms a pattern which could serve as a projection of what might come in the future. So Aurobindo saw this greater, newer, larger consciousness, which is called the supramental. And one essential characteristic by which he describes it is that it is capable of seizing the whole, the totality, the integrality of existence. Even of ourselves as human beings, we only know a fraction of our ideas and feelings and thoughts. We don't know the whole sum of what I am as a person. My conscious powers, the subconscious, what's beyond that. We know very little even of ourselves, even less of the universe around us. Some secrets of nature, yes, science has discovered, but no more than that. Now, this consciousness, according to his experience, has the capacity to seize the whole in knowledge and in its powers of will and action and emotion. And yet not to see the whole as a vague totality without content, but it sees the details of the structure within the whole. The language is interesting. To grasp the whole in one movement, not by a slow process of analysis which only gives you one part at a time. It does not give you the whole. To see the whole and yet to see the structure of the whole in all the details and the interaction of the details among themselves and with the whole, and the potencies and powers that create the whole and make it function and put each of the parts in its own place. Now, in this work, Aurobindo was joined by the mother. And their work right through the last century was an exploration of this dimension of consciousness. What is it? And they worked on it like scientists work in their laboratory in the field of natural sciences. They experimented. They took nothing for granted in their experiment of education, of consciousness, In fact, very recently we have a remarkable publication in 2 big volumes called The Record of Yoga, in which Aurobindo has noted, in longhand he had noted the details of the experiments he was going through, and in fact the publication of this work has only happened in the last few years. Now this was their immediate path of exploration, to explore human evolution for the time when man would be faced with that crisis, and what would he do? And if we follow the process of evolution and a prior process of involution, which could only make evolution possible, you would see that this larger consciousness must be present not only in the structures of the mind that we know, but in the forms and patterns and movements of life, and in the very constitution and composition of matter itself. Otherwise, how would it emerge out of it? You cannot implant a large consciousness on something which is not sensitive to it, which is in itself not another form of the same consciousness. It is only a process of unveiling. That is the sense of evolution. This is very briefly shared, I agree, but I hope I'm able to convey at least a sense of what one feels about it. Now this is a process, as Aurobindo and the mother saw, of life, of nature, which takes its own course. We'll see perhaps in the second sequence how it has taken its own course. But I guess being part of the Indian tradition and that sense of the practical in dealing with human nature. The sense of the practical in dealing with human nature is a very strong element of Indian parampara, if I may use that word. He examined all the old yogic disciplines known in India. Raj Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Gyan Yoga, the yogas of the Tantra, their disciplines, the synthetic yoga of the Gita, and all the other tributaries, to see what is the one common lever of dynamic change which is common to all these processes, which, putting aside the esoteric form or language that one uses, these disciplines are really meant to take different parts of our psychological being to a height of their own development. The mind to a development of knowledge, bhakti to a development of the emotions, and similarly the others, and hatha yoga for the body and the life part. So he wanted to extract the lever of dynamic change which was common to all these disciplines. And he found that all these disciplines correspond, each one, to the pattern of natural sciences that modern science has laid bare, and to the forces and movements by which universal nature works out the process of evolution on earth in its upward striving from matter up to mind and what's beyond. So it is not something which is created in isolation. It is an extraction of the lever of dynamic change, and he saw the correspondence with the movements of universal nature, with the scientist's studies in his laboratory. That is the nature of the synthesis. So we can be quite happily content by making life take its own course, and we grow in it, as we shall see in the second sequence. But if there is a call felt in a human being to pursue this path in more awareness, more cognizance, and perhaps greater joy, then that path also is experimented with and laid before us. The second sequence that unfolds in this perspective is interestingly something which dates from the European Renaissance of the 16th century. Man set out to discover the forces of nature by the reductionist method, and to see how those forces which operate in universal nature could be made use of to create tools which could be put at the service of man for his comfort, for his well-being. not for his harm. That was not the intention originally. And since it was a reductionist method which was followed, the mental faculty being at its best in following that, the method it sought to apply was the subject that you took in hand to study, to break it up into its smallest elements, its little components, to study them, because it's easy to study an isolated part. Having arrived at that knowledge, to put it together, make an aggregate, and say this is sum of knowledge. And certainly the results have been astounding. Let's not minimize them. Sometimes when we talk of the spiritual or of yoga, we tend to minimize the value of science and technology and the purpose that they have not only served, but are increasingly serving today. I would like to share that with you also. Now, in this exploration of matter, in recent decades, it's interesting to note the time factor of these two movements. Aurobindo and the mother started the work early years of the last century. But these discoveries have only come to us in the last few decades in a more mature form, though they did begin in the third decade of the 20th century. In exploring the composition of matter, the physicist first, the biologist also, the physicist found that there are no longer parts in the constitution of matter. Can you imagine the irreversible nature of this discovery? For a long time, the physicist never talked about it, never pronounced it, because he himself couldn't accept it. Even now, it's not easy for him. He discovered that there was something of the quality of a whole in terms of energy that was at the root of matter. Not parts. You could not break it up into parts. And that whole was present in each of the parts and gave to the parts its own determinant function within the whole. How close we are coming to a language we have just used in the name of Aurobindo in talking about the supramental consciousness factor and not the physicist working in his laboratory. Somehow, I should not make it personal, but perhaps it has to be since I'm sharing it with you as an individual. It seems to me to be the most significant thing in our times in which we live. We talk of the changes taking place in our time. We don't always know what's the drift of the change. What should we do? But this is the root thing. The nature of matter is found to be that of a whole. The word consciousness is not yet used with hesitation, but that it's a whole of energy which you cannot break up. That, yes. It is an irreversible degree in the field of natural sciences, the discovery of a whole of energy by reductionist method. The contradiction is complete. There must be some superior higher humor in this universe that you arrive at it by such contradictory means. And interestingly enough, those who are technocrats here would know much better than I do, but as a lay person, this much one can sense. All the present technology that we use today, from our little mobile to computer to laser to non-localization, laser surgery, the list is endless. All that is issues from the knowledge of potencies and their utilization that's been gained from this discovery. It's an absolutely stunning and irreversible situation. You can't go back on it. You'll go further. There will be perhaps a constant repetition of the same, of technology utilizing the same process or whatever. But the fact remains that there is a complete knowledge which has reversed whatever knowledge was held before. And it goes further, that the entire material universe functions in the same web-like manner of totality. It's like you touch one strand anywhere and the whole vibrates with it. These are not pronouncements of a great rishi or seer in his moments of meditation and some higher state of consciousness. It's not even the result of some great idealistic philosophy. This is a discovery in matter, our very base of existence. However high we may plane with our spirit or our mind, we are still rooted in this body. That's where we stand on earth. That's a fact. What do we do with this situation? These are the interesting scenarios that come up. And here is man faced with this discovery, with this technology, finding that the problems of the world get more and more complex, more and more interrelated. You can't solve them all. And if you touch one or create a fresh problem, it adds to the total sum of problems you have already. It makes it more complex. It makes it harder to solve. That's why nothing's moving at the moment and you feel everything is a stalemate. This is exactly where we stand. And on the other hand, we have two very contrasting things. We have a technology which has made us live in another time and space. From very simple examples to greater ones. You pick up a little mobile. You formerly had a desk telephone. You expected to find a certain person at a certain time, at a certain place. Now you pick up a mobile. The person that you're trying to get could be anywhere in the world, could be doing anything. You haven't a notion. Suddenly, through that little call, you are transported in space and time in an astonishing manner. You take it for granted because you're used to it. But we realize, what is it doing to our thinking and our feeling? Our sense of the world will grow. Our sense of space will change. Our sense of time will change. Our means of communication will change. They are no longer external. They were not internalized in terms of consciousness, but they are still internalized in terms of the absolute objective. They are subjective up to a point. And the latest points of research in the field of science are in the field of the micro. It fascinates me somehow. Not the macro. The results that are achieved are applied in the macro. But the research is in micro, whether it's microchips or it's laser surgery with the minimum of material intrusion, or it's microfinance. It's as though you want to get to the smallest to open out to the largest. Somehow a lot of the old wisdom of the microcosm and the macrocosm keeps coming back to you in contemporary times with these things. On the other hand, the contradiction is of us as human beings. Here we are in a wide world. Our communication, our travel, the globalization in strategic terms or economic terms or whatever, down to dress habits and food habits and everything, is there with us. Yet our mind still retains its essential quality. The imbalance between what we have created in the objective world and what we are in terms of our subjective consciousness is quite untenable. And yet it's exercising a tremendous transforming role. One sees that slowly people are beginning to think differently. Slowly, under pressure of what the objective world is giving us. We're beginning to feel differently. You have sympathy for cultures and peoples around the world, not a full identification, but you have an understanding, you have a feeling. Your habits are changing, things are changing. So whether we follow a conscious yoga of change of consciousness or not, I mean the very objective world that we live in is bringing about a change in our manner of being. This leads us to another very important question of our times. There is such a need at the moment to discover new ways of life, new ways of being. In a sense, the old cultures of the past, cultures in the sense of values, or in the sense, I would say, of political ideologies, certainly, we've seen them all, or in terms of economic models, the distribution of wealth around the world, so many other things. You know, these are areas, education, new forms of education, these are areas in which we are seeking for new things. We don't quite know in what direction, but we wanted to change something in life. It is amazing to see how Aurobindo and the mother worked out around 19, 20, 30, this path of integral yoga. Today you see around the world a number of what they call transformative practices. It's become a very interesting phrase. And there are many people around the world who are working out different patterns which suit the cultural norms and mindsets of those countries, of how you can consciously move into new ways of living. I find two things fascinating here before we move on to the third and final sequence. Here was an attempt by Aurobindo and the mother made by exploration in consciousness, though done by a method which was rigorous, austere experimentation, like all yogic disciplines in India have done for millennia. That is not new. No yoga in India has come about without that rigor of experimentation which a scientist shows in his own field. And somewhere around the middle of the last century, but much more towards the end of it, science in its exploration of matter by a reductionist process, not by a process of experimentation by intuition and subjective means, but by objective and analytic means. It has arrived at the discovery of wholes. Not wholes perhaps at the level of the mind or the life, but certainly in matter and the functioning of the material universe, and biology in its research into the living cells which form the body, which form the body of matter, whether it be matter of plant or animal or the human. That's arrived at something of a similar nature. Now here we are, the beginning of the third millennium. Two processes, one in consciousness, one by the means of the scientist in his laboratory. The methods are contradictory in the extreme, if one likes to use the word extreme. The results are convergent. Is this not an exceptional moment in human evolution when the achievement of integration and totality and wholeness becomes a possibility? Not only a possibility, it becomes inevitable. The third and final sequence is something which I think we all live, and therefore it's nearer to us, because the beginnings may be rudimentary, but they're there. You see, one never really knows something that one doesn't know in one's experience. one sees a generation coming up in India as elsewhere around the world. And I don't think the generational fact is one of years. It's a question of beings and their consciousness. Because there are people who can count many years behind them, but many years ahead of them also. And their consciousness is very aware of this. This generation has a very different sense of the material and the spiritual, and the opposition between the two, the antinomy between matter and spirit, which is the most fundamental of all the antinomies known to man, to any philosophy, any thought, any way of life, any civilization. That line seems to be thinning. The material and the immaterial are kind of creating an expanse between them, where you don't know where really you stand. And this generation has a sense of the spiritual, but they want to manifest it in the material. They have a sense that the material carries the germs of that spiritual, that it is a curious kind of a resting place for the spiritual, which traditionally we have not been accustomed to experience. It's a kind of a new spiritual that molds matter, that even the scientist is discovering as emerging in it. And it wants to create new forms, which are very often hard to recognize. They don't conform to any of the old forms of ritualism or spiritual life or spiritual thinking. But a few things which are characteristic and which in their qualities show there's another kind of consciousness, 2 or 3 points which we can identify much more easily are, they have a sense of transparency. They want everything to be clear and transparent, and they have a sense of the integral. They don't want things piecemeal. They want the totality, whether in their own being or their own life or the way of living or the way of working. All the science of ecology and all the rest, they're little offshoots of this, or globalization. This is the essential. The other, and that you see in all the disciplines of the world today, they're in need of creating holistic structures, whether you see them from architecture to the disciplines of natural sciences or anything. Holistic structures in which there is the richness of diversity, but there's a basis of oneness. And of course we really run into the problem when we come to religion and to international relations. I mean, we know all the problems of the modern world, so we won't go into that. But they need to combine these two in holistic forms and structures. And I think another quality that they have is that what they're trying to do must be a fact of experience. It must be lived in. Not a profession of faith, and not a profession of intent. You know, a profession of intent can take you very often away from just living it. These are somehow some of the qualities that you see in evidence, and they seem to be symbolic of the kind of future that we seem to be living in our present times. And as far as one's attraction to Aurobindo and the mother and their work grows, it's because they make some of these signs more easy to decipher, and they're like signposts that you can hold on to and move ahead. Well, thank you for letting me share all this to you, because when Raji talked about this event, somehow this is what came to me, and I wasn't quite sure if it was the right theme to share, but I could not go off this theme into another, so I stuck to it. And I would like once again to say how deeply I appreciate the fact that with all of you here, Kapilaji is sitting right there, and she's listened to me and shared it and responded. I felt that right across the room, even if you went physically any closer. So thank you very much for that.